Long ago, beneath the dim glow of oil lamps and the rustle of papyrus scrolls, artisans in ancient Egypt practiced a quiet craft, one that combined beauty, ritual, and a surprising amount of melted animal fat. This is not the story of kings or wars. It is the tale of scented wigs, carefully stitched from linen and hair, steeped in fragrant oils, and worn like a second crown. Tonight, we'll drift back through quiet alleyways and firelit workshops to uncover the forgotten pages of a perfumed manual and the people who followed it, strand by strand. Let your mind wander now to dusty courtyards, boiling pots, and the slow work of hands that never rushed. Because in ancient Egypt, even making a wig could be a sacred ritual. If you enjoy slow, sleepy stories from the corners of history, consider leaving a quiet like or subscribing so you can drift off with us again soon. And if you have a curious topic you'd like to hear one night, you can gently leave it in the comments below. You are lying back beneath the ancient linen canopy of a house in Thebes. The air is heavy with a scent you can't quite place. Floral but earthy, something like lotus, layered with hints of cedar resin and goat fat. This is not a dream. You're here to learn about wigs. Yes, wigs. Not the ones powdered and perched atop judges' heads in old courtrooms, nor the luminous synthetic ones of modern cosplay, but the original form, Egyptian ceremonial wigs, practical wigs, celebratory wigs, each layered, curled, and scented with the same kind of care that a priest might reserve for preparing temple incense. In the golden age of Egypt's 18th dynasty, around 1400 BCE, life was full of rules. There were rules for agriculture, for entering a room, for pronouncing the name of the king. And naturally, there were rules for wigs. Let's start with the foundation. Wigs weren't just fashion accessories, they were status symbols, hygiene, solutions, religious tools, and sometimes even spiritual armor. Egypt was hot, lice were abundant, and yet the elite needed to appear in public looking cool, controlled, and somehow unbothered by all that desert grit. So they shaved their heads and wore wigs, often made of human hair, imported animal hair, or plant fibers like palm husk. These wigs weren't just thrown together, they were meticulously constructed according to strict guidelines, which were written down, passed between wig makers, and whispered through temple corridors. One such guideline survives in pieces. A scroll attributed to the House of Keeper, Master, wig artisan to Queen Tai. This scroll began with the phrase, "To crown the head is to calm the spirit," an oddly poetic start to a recipe list, but then, that's how Egyptians treated most crafts, with reverence. The first ingredient wasn't hair, surprisingly. It was oil. More precisely, a binding agent made from castor oil and beeswax, sometimes thickened with cow's milk. This sticky concoction was gently heated and blended in a terracotta mixing bowl. Next came the hair itself, often cleaned in natron, a kind of salt, soaked in palm wine, and dried in the sun. Wigmakers would then take threads of this hair and braid them over papyrus cords, which provided flexibility and structure. Each strand could be dyed with crushed carob pods or indigo for different effects. Dark black was favored by both men and women, but reddish-brown streaks were considered flirtatious. The wig styles varied by era and occasion. For formal court events, you might see the tripartite wig, a three-part piece with two wide lobes, over the shoulders and a central curtain of curls behind. These curls weren't natural. Each was shaped using bronze rods and set with clay, then gently baked under the sun or near coals. And then, just before the wig was fitted to its wearer, came the scenting. You may find it odd, but ancient Egyptian wigs were perfumed with a level of devotion one might expect for sacred objects. Cones of fragrant fat were placed atop the head and allowed to melt slowly through the wig during hot days, releasing scents like frankincense, cinnamon, or blue lotus. These scent cones weren't merely cosmetic. They signified status, comfort, and divine favor. Some priests believed they kept away malevolent spirits. The preparation of these scented cones was itself a trade. Recipes included rendered goose fat mixed with imported myrrh from Punt and crushed chamomile. A well-made scent cone might take days to harden in the shade. Only the wealthiest wore them daily. Common folk did without, or sometimes used perfumed, cloths hidden inside caps. In the workshop of a wig maker, the air would have been thick with the tang of oils, the burning warmth of dye pots, and the buzzing commentary of apprentices arguing over curl placement. The headrest on which wigs were styled, typically made from sycamore wood, was a prized tool passed down through families, and then, once the wig was shaped and scented, it had to be approved. Not by the client, by the priest hairdresser, a temple-appointed role that ensured one's hairstyle aligned with spiritual and astrological principles. A crooked curl could be a bad omen. A scent too strong might irritate the gods. So you can imagine a master wigmaker's anxiety when preparing a ceremonial piece for someone like Queen Tai, whose entire public image was defined by her dramatic headdress and wide wings of curled hair. It's said that Queen Tia's final ceremonial wig, preserved in part at the Cairo Museum, used over 300 strands of imported hair, each stitched with tiny gold discs and infused with a scent of lotus and acacia wood. The preparation took nearly 40 days, coinciding, perhaps not accidentally, with the mummification cycle. But let's return to the everyday, because not every Egyptian could afford these elaborate hairpieces. The middle class might settle for short, plaited wigs made from sheep wool or dyed flax. These were practical, affordable, and easier to wash. Some were designed with open mesh, allowing the scalp to breathe in the summer heat. In fact, a merchant's letter from Amarna notes a delayed shipment of scented scalp nettings, likely an early form of budget wig. Even soldiers were known to wear simple wigs on ceremonial days, particularly during rituals of return or after battle. Still, the allure of the elite wig endured. One apprentice's training diary includes a note about the dream of styling curls for the god king, which suggests that wig-making was not only a trade, but an aspiration, a holy calling in a way. The manual from the House of Keeper also included warnings. Never mix cedar oil and fish glue. It smells awful. Avoid using goat hair in summer. It attracts flies. And always wash your hands in rose water before touching the final piece. A dirty hand, they believed, could curse a wig, and perhaps the strangest instruction: if a woman asks for 29 curls, give her 30, so the gods will not think her vain. What kind of spiritual logic lies beneath that extra curl? Why would one, more ringlet, protect the wearer from divine scrutiny? That's a question we'll explore in Section 2, where we'll slip behind the walls of a royal palace to witness the role of wigs in court life, diplomacy, and divine ritual. The scent of the melted cones still lingers faintly in the corridors. Somewhere, incense burns, slow and thick. But now, you're no longer in the wigmaker's workshop. You're in the back rooms of the palace complex, places rarely mentioned in formal inscriptions. These were the hidden wings where servants, braided advisors whispered, and queens prepared their presence, curl by deliberate curl. Wigs were not merely ornaments here. They were instruments of political language. Within these palace walls, a woman's hairstyle could speak louder than her titles. Take Queen Tia again, wife to Amenhotep III, and mother of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. Her public image was meticulously curated. Her wigs were not just beautiful, they were declarative. A wig with broad squared shoulders implied stability and matriarchal power. A wig styled into rows of long ringlets evoked divine femininity, drawing parallels between the queen and Hathor, the goddess of joy, music, and motherhood. On diplomatic visits, Tia's wigs were adjusted subtly to echo the aesthetic of the visiting court: tight curls when Nubian officials were present, looser waves when delegations from the Levant came through. These small gestures, encoded in hair, said more than any treaty. And yet behind the scenes, the process was painstaking. The royal wig chamber was a secured room, staffed by only the most trusted artisans. Each wig rested on carved busts, shaped to match the exact cranial structure of the wearer. Records show Queen Ti had 5 such busts, each for a different ceremonial function, one for New Year's, another for fertility rites, one for court appearances, one for mourning, and one, simply listed as mirror, perhaps reserved, for her private reflection rituals. Braiding sessions were long, several hours, often conducted in silence, except for the soft splash of oil being warmed in alabaster dishes. Ostrich feather fans moved rhythmically. Between every 6th braid, a pause, where rosewater was dabbed along the scalp, or a charm was whispered into the strands. These weren't ordinary charms. They were formulas drawn from temple papyri, invocations of Mayat, goddess of truth and cosmic balance, meant to ward off gossip, misfortune, or political betrayal. Some scholars suggest that the number and placement of curls on a queen's wig were deliberately chosen to align with astrological events. For example, a documented wig with 365 curls, worn only once a year, likely symbolized the passage of time, making the queen an embodiment of the calendar itself. But this coded language wasn't just for queens. Even minor nobles participated in the wig economy of symbolism. A vizier might request a wig with 7 forward curls, signifying insight, or with a streak of gold thread braid to signal favor from the pharaoh. High priests wore wigs arranged to form subtle hieroglyphic patterns, lines that, when viewed from above, resembled offerings or prayers. There was power in this visual vocabulary, so much so that rival factions at court were rumored to spy on each other's wigs, trying to decipher hidden messages or intentions. One letter from a palace scribe complains that a rival official had copied the curling pattern of a superior, a form of stylistic plagiarism seen as both disrespectful and politically provocative. Wig theft, surprisingly, was a crime, punishable in some periods by temple labor, especially if the wig in question was ceremonial or bore the scent of exclusive resins like labdanum or kai-fi, which only the royal workshops had access to. Stolen wigs weren't just material goods. They were stolen identities. And then there were mourning wigs. These were among the most carefully constructed, yet least decorated, made from unadorned black hair braid. Braided tightly and close to the scalp, they signified humility before the gods. Mourners, especially professional mourners hired by temples, wore them during funerals and rituals of renewal. Yet even in grief, details mattered. The number of braids, their placement, and the presence of minute red ochre beads all conveyed spiritual meaning. Interestingly, wigs also played a role in justice. Judges during certain dynasties wore balance wigs, so called because of their symmetrical curls and straight parting meant to symbolize fairness. A crooked wig on a judge was a sign of potential corruption, or simply bad craftsmanship. Either way, it caused comment. One surviving text describes an entire case being delayed because the court could not proceed under a crooked curl, and in the military, even here, wigs found a role, albeit limited. While soldiers did not wear wigs in combat, those promoted to administrative roles or honored with court appearances were issued a simple ceremonial wig, usually made of braided horsehair. These wigs signaled their transition from warrior to bureaucrat, from spear to scroll. But the politics of hair did not stop at Egypt's borders. Wigs were also tools of diplomacy. Foreign dignitaries often returned home with gifts from the royal wig chamber, perfumed headpieces accompanied by scrolls explaining their cultural meaning. One particularly lavish example was sent to the Queen of Mitanni, a dark curled wig adorned with carnelian beads, scented with blue lotus oil, and enclosed in a cedar box. The scroll with it offered instructions on preserving harmony through the scalp's balance of oils. Even mummification reflected the importance of wigs. Though the hair was often preserved on the body, many elites chose to be buried with their finest wigs beside them, perhaps as an offering to Osiris, or perhaps simply to ensure their best self would appear in the field of reeds, the Egyptian afterlife. Some tombs contain small compartments, wig boxes, placed just behind the sarcophagus, where curls still rest. stiff with ancient oil, locked forever in ceremonial shape. Yet among all these details, curled codes, scented rituals, hair as power, perhaps the most curious aspect was how completely the act of wig wearing was integrated into the Egyptian sense of identity. To shave one's head and crown it anew each morning was more than a habit. It was a daily rite of self-presentation, one that merged hygiene, religion, art, and politics in a way few other cultures have ever managed. And the manual from the house of Kepa, fragmentary though it is, reflects this fusion. Its final pages, those that survive, include a prayer, not to a god, but to the hands. May the fingers stay steady, the oil stay warm, and the hair lie in peace. May the curl not twist the wrong way, nor the scent offend the air. For what crowns, the head speaks to the soul beneath it. A simple blessing, yet deeply revealing. In a culture obsessed with order and symbolism, even hair was sacred text. But how did the practice evolve? In time, new rulers would rise, some who rejected tradition, others who expanded it. The wigs themselves would change in size, style, and meaning. Some would be buried, some burnt, others displayed in foreign museums thousands of years later. What happened when the style fell out of favor? What did it mean when Egyptians began abandoning the scented cone? That's the story we'll follow. In Section 3, where we trace the decline of the wig's status, its transformation through dynastic upheaval, and its curious afterlife in history and archaeology. The cones began to cool, not all at once and not everywhere, but slowly, like a ritual forgotten rather than forbidden. What was once a daily ceremony began to vanish, not with rebellion, but with erosion. The age of wigs, once the mark of refinement and spiritual alignment, began its long decline. The first signs were subtle. Art from the early New Kingdom depicted elaborate wigs towering in tiers of curls. But by the late 19th dynasty, figures shown in tombs and frescoes wore shorter styles. Curls became fewer, less symmetrical. The once popular perfume cones, those fragrant domes of beeswax and myrrh, began to appear less frequently in imagery. Even the hieroglyphs used to represent beauty and purity started favoring references to linen and eyeshadow, not hair. Several factors played into this quiet shift. First, fashion. As dynasties passed and new court aesthetics emerged, simplicity became a statement in itself. Queen Tuzret, one of the last rulers of the 19th dynasty, was depicted with minimal adornment. Her wigs, when shown at all, lacked the signature volume of earlier queens. Instead, she favored tight side braids, plain and utilitarian. But it wasn't just taste. Economics played a role. Long before the collapse of centralized Egyptian power, records show a gradual decrease in imported oils and resins. Myrrh shipments from Punt became less frequent. The blue lotus fields near the Nile Delta were increasingly reserved for temple use, and ingredients once common in household wig cones became rare commodities. Wig making, too, suffered under the weight of bureaucracy and inflation. Where once the House of Kepa trained dozens of apprentices each decade, records show that by the 21st dynasty, only a handful remained. The elaborate head molds carved from cedar became difficult to replace. Imported cedar itself became scarce. Wig boxes, once ornate and perfumed with scented linen, were replaced with undecorated clay jars, often marked only with initials or numbers. Even tombs reflected the shift. In earlier burials, wigs were laid beside the body, carefully wrapped, in embroidered linen. But by the third intermediate period, most tombs featured only the natural hair of the deceased, if preserved at all. The custom of burial wigs lingered in elite circles, but the materials changed. Horsehair replaced human hair. The scent? Fainter. The detail? Looser. Religious shifts compounded the decline. With the rise of Amun-Re as supreme deity, a more austere spirituality took hold, especially under high priests who gradually assumed royal power themselves. These new leaders emphasized humility and internal piety over outward ritual. Wigs, once seen as sacred, became symbols of excess. Some priests even issued informal edicts, discouraging their use outside formal festivals. In one preserved letter from the Karnak archives, a temple scribe writes, "Let the worshippers come bare-scalped, without ornament. The gods seek devotion, not decoration." It's unlikely that wigs were banned outright, but attitudes shifted. To wear one began to suggest vanity or a clinging to the old ways. Still, not everyone let go. A small group of artisans in western Thebes continued producing ceremonial wigs for local noblewomen well into the late dynastic period. These were simpler, few, curls, minimal decoration, but the intention remained. A quiet echo of tradition. Curiously, some foreign cultures adopted the Egyptian wig long after it fell out of fashion in its homeland. In Nubia, elaborate braided wigs became part of ceremonial dress. In Meroe, centuries later, queens wore versions of the Egyptian wig crown, short, geometric styles adorned with gold clasps. These weren't direct imitations, but reinterpretations. The scent cones were gone, but the symbolism lingered. Then came the Greeks. After Alexander the Great's conquest and the rise of the Ptolemaic dynasty, new hairstyles dominated Alexandria. Greek-Egyptian fusion fashion favored more natural curls, pinned rather than woven. The complex wig manuals were no longer taught. The House of Kepa, if it still existed, left no record. What had once been a daily rite, part hygiene, part theology, part art, became novelty, an exotic relic of the past. Roman Egypt buried it further. Romans admired Egyptian linen and jewelry, but showed little interest in scented wigs. While Roman women had their own wig traditions, often using blonde hair from Gaul, they didn't inherit the full ritualism of the Egyptian practice. In frescoes, Egyptian priestesses depicted in Roman style appear with natural hair or simple veils. The cone had cooled completely. Centuries passed. Temples crumbled. The language changed. Papyrus turned to dust, but fragments remained. In 1887, an excavation near Amarna revealed a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in layers of brittle linen, was a child-sized wig, brown, curled with traces of myrrh still clinging to its base. A faded ink symbol on the box lid read, "For joy in the garden." It may have belonged to a noble child, or perhaps a performer. We will never know. In another tomb near Luxor, archaeologists uncovered the remains of what appears to be a travel-sized cone mold, along with a broken alabaster cup bearing the faint residue of lotus resin. It's unclear if the mold was ever used, but its presence, unmarked and tucked beside a mirror shard, suggests that someone, long after the practice had faded, still remembered. And in the museum halls of Europe, you may see the curls today. Dried, lacquered, labelled, some behind glass, some misidentified. One wig, displayed in Berlin, bears a tag reading "Ritual Mask Fringe," though scholars believe it to be a portion of a funerary wig once worn by a priestess of Hathor. The question remains, why did it fade? Was it practicality, austerity, or simply that people forgot? Perhaps there was no single reason. Like all human rituals, the wig tradition in Egypt may have reached a natural end, outpaced by trade routes, changing gods, and the daily grind of survival in an evolving world. And yet the details endure. The careful braids, the prayers murmured over heated oils, the way a single curl could signal a whole season's worth of meaning. Even now, when you stand among the fragments, when you read the surviving portions of the House of Keeper's manual, you can hear echoes, instructions that once guided hands now drift like perfume across time. They tell us, quietly, about who we were, creatures of ritual, of vanity and meaning, of scent and symbol. And of all the things we wore, perhaps none were as rich in significance, nor as intimately human as the wigs we wore to greet the gods. So the next time you come across a lock of braided hair in a museum drawer, Or see a depiction of a woman with curls flowing behind her crown. Remember, she may have spoken without speaking, told truths without words, and shaped her world with nothing more than a comb, and the scent of blue lotus at dawn. You are walking across a wide, dusty plain. The earth beneath you is rutted with the grooves of cartwheels and the hoofprints of horses. Every few miles, a structure rises on the horizon, a low building with thick wooden beams and smoke drifting from a cooking fire. You've just arrived at a yijan. This is not just a rest stop. It's a hub in one of the most efficient communication networks the world had yet seen. You're in the Tang dynasty, somewhere around the 8th century CE, and you're here to sleep, eat, and most importantly, carry a sealed message to the next station. You're a courier, and your boots are filled with rice. But before we get to that, let's step back. The Tang dynasty ruled China from 618 to 907 CE, and at its peak, it governed a population of nearly 80 million people spread across sprawling territories from Central Asia to the Korean peninsula. For such a vast domain, communication was key, not just between nobles and governors, but between monasteries, border outposts, tea merchants, and tax collectors. Enter the Chuanxin, or letter, couriers. These were not lone riders galloping across deserts like in folk tales. The Tang postal system was bureaucratic, highly coordinated, and, by most accounts, stunningly boring. But boring didn't mean inefficient, quite the opposite. Over 1,600 official postal stations dotted the empire's roads, forming a relay system where each courier was responsible for a set leg of the journey. Messages could travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days, passing from one dusty hand to the next. And the rules were strict. A Tang courier wasn't simply someone who could ride a horse. He was a civil servant. Many came from farming families, selected not for speed, but for reliability. You didn't need to be fast, just persistent. You needed to know your route. You had to memorize river crossings and alternate mountain passes in case of flood. You had to follow a precise script when handing off messages, and most importantly, you had to follow what might have been the strangest protocol of all. You were to sleep in your boots. Why? It wasn't out of superstition or fashion. It was efficiency. Each courier had a scheduled departure, down to the hour. Sleep was permitted between runs, but only on site at a station and only in full uniform. Boots on, cloak fastened, pouch by the head. The idea was simple. If an urgent dispatch arrived early, you had to be ready to move within 5 minutes. Waking up to trot half asleep out into a snowstorm wasn't glamorous. But Tang officials didn't care about glamour. They cared about stability. And those boots, they weren't just footwear. They were tools, made of woven hemp or leather. Tang courier. Boots were sturdy and often lined with straw for insulation. But some, particularly in the colder northern provinces, were stuffed with something else entirely. Cooked rice, not loose rice. Sticky rice, pressed flat, like insulation pads. The rice held warmth, absorbed sweat, and could, in emergencies, be eaten. Some accounts even suggest a method for replacing the rice layers at each station, like changing socks, though no full manual survives. A preserved Tang ledger from a station near Chang'an records. Pairs of courier boots replaced, inner layers moist. Rice reused in cookpot. Whether this rice layering was common or limited to certain routes is unclear, but the concept isn't unique. Other historical cultures used edible or thermal fillers in clothing. The Tang just systematized. The courier diet was equally regulated. You were allotted 2 rice cakes per day, often flavored with pickled mustard greens or dried plum. Broth was available at stations, usually boiled with scallion tops and bits of river fish. Alcohol was banned, except for warming tonic on winter routes. A courier caught drinking wine could be dismissed or reassigned to manure hauling duty, which, unfortunately, was a real post. Personal belongings were limited to 1 satchel. Many carried a flint, a copper ring for signalling, and a square of waxed linen that doubled as a rain guard and eating mat. But what most prized was their route tablet, a carved wooden slip bearing the route number, destination, and their name. Lose your tablet, and you risked being mistaken for a bandit. Despite the rigid structure, courier life had its freedoms. You were exempt from many local taxes. You could sleep in protected government lodges, and you saw parts of the empire most people never dreamed of. Forest paths lined with wild ginger, dusty steppe routes shimmering with heat, lakeside towns with bamboo fishing rafts drifting in the twilight. You also learned the signs of trouble, before governors did. A burned-out inn, an unusual number of beggars along the road. Rumours of rebellion passed in hushed tones at a rest. Stop. Couriers were among the first to sense shifts in the empire's pulse, even if they couldn't speak of them openly. One courier, Lu Ping, left behind a rare written record, his logbook. Found centuries later in the Mogao caves near Dunhuang, it contains short, matter-of-fact entries. Cold wind, child at station had frostbite, message sealed from capital, road early. Monastery gave pair, saw smoke in distance, no fire at next stop. Odd, boot tore, used sash to bind, made time. His words aren't dramatic, but they reveal the texture of the job, steady, mundane, and quietly vital. He rode through sandstorms, across thawing rivers, and through sun-baked fields of millet, always arriving, always passing the message, always sleeping in his boots. Some couriers became local legends, not for feats of daring, but for reliability. One, known only as Old Two, ran the same 19-kilometre route for 42 years without a single delay. When he died, villagers planted bamboo at each of the 3 turns in his path. A Tang poet later wrote, "The wind knows Two's boots, the river knows his breath, and yet, for all its structure, the Tang courier system wasn't immune to decay." As the central government weakened in the late 9th century, station funding declined. Roads fell into disrepair, corruption increased, with some posts assigning relatives or underqualified riders to the routes. Messages were delayed, rebellions were missed, and the once sacred policy of boots on sleep began to fade. But in its prime, it worked. For nearly 2 centuries, the Tang relay system moved edicts, poetry, tea orders, marriage contracts, and temple petitions across the vast map of East Asia, each step guided by tired eyes, muddy cloaks, and boots lined with old rice. And while those boots now crumble in forgotten tombs, the legacy remains. You can still trace the old courier paths in parts of modern China, some paved, some buried beneath new cities. Archaeologists have uncovered the foundations of Yizhan inns near Luoyang and the remains of a rest station latrine with a wooden message stick lodged beneath a collapsed beam. How it got there, no one knows, but perhaps, like the couriers themselves, it just kept moving forward. You're standing beside your horse now. It's not yours, technically. None of the horses are. They belong to the station. You just ride them for a few miles, then swap for another. These are relay horses, trained for bursts of energy, not endurance. Their backs are broad, hooves trimmed short, and they wear simple tack that can be fastened or removed in seconds. A stable attendant waves you on without speaking. You show him your route tablet, and he nods, disappearing into the gloom of the stable to fetch your fresh mount. No ceremony, just routine. Tang Dynasty couriers weren't chosen for their conversation skills. In fact, silence was expected. Unless you were reporting a problem, your job was to ride, hand off the message, and move on. You were a body in motion, not a messenger in the modern sense. The words weren't yours to know. Messages were kept inside sealed tubes, typically made of bamboo or lacquered wood. These tubes were marked with an official stamp, either carved in jade or pressed in wax, and many included twine seals strung through tiny holes that, if broken, indicated tampering. You didn't know what was written inside, and you didn't ask. Some tubes had multiple compartments, one for the message, one for the return slip, one Perhaps for a wax tablet inscribed with coded marks indicating urgency or secrecy. Few people outside the capital could read those codes. If the seal was broken on arrival, it was your responsibility, even if it broke in a storm or from heat. Punishment varied by region. A minor breach might mean an extra month of service. A serious one could mean public humiliation, or worse, reassignment to a dung transport team. You learned very quickly to guard the tube like your life depended on it, and in some cases it did. During the reign of Emperor Xuanzong, around 742 CE, tensions on the western frontier had grown unstable. Nomadic groups were pressing into Tang territory, and local governors were sending increasingly urgent pleas to the capital. One courier, Wen Yong, was tasked with delivering a scroll containing strategic deployment plans for a cavalry division, stationed along the Hexi corridor. He never arrived. Accounts differ on what happened. Some say he fell ill at a roadside shrine and buried the message to protect it. Others say he was robbed. A few historians believe he defected, perhaps paid off by an enemy general. But a more plausible explanation is that he lost the message in a sandstorm near Jiayuguan. A search party found nothing but his broken tablet and one of his boots, empty, torn open, rice still inside. Whatever the truth, the absence of that message caused a 2-week delay in military movements. When the Tang reinforcements finally reached the frontier, the enemy had already passed. It was a rare failure in an otherwise well-oiled machine. In response, the Ministry of Works issued a revised courier manual. Among the new rules, every message longer than 1 foot in scroll length had to be double-tubed and tied to the rider's waist with a hemp cord. Boots were now to be laced with an additional cross loop, and couriers on critical routes were required to check in every 3 stations. The bureaucratic response was swift, dry, and extensive. Exactly the way the Tang preferred to handle disruption. But not all problems could be solved by regulations. The routes themselves posed daily challenges. Mountain passes near Sichuan could become impassable after spring rains. In the south, heat and damp led to rot and illness. In the north, the wind was so dry and sharp that parchment messages sometimes cracked mid-journey. And in many places, the roads weren't roads at all, just paths carved by hooves and habit. To navigate, couriers relied on memory. There were no printed maps. Instead, each rider was given a wooden route tablet carved with symbols, mileage notches, and, in some cases, tiny inlaid stones marking seasonal hazards. These tablets were passed down like heirlooms. Some bore nicknames like Windtooth Path or the Stomach Line, the latter referencing a road so bumpy it upset your guts by mile 5. One especially notorious route, running between 2 Buddhist temples in modern-day Sichuan, was nicknamed the Leech Mile. In summer, the roadside brush would swarm with leeches that flung themselves at passing legs. Couriers there wore waxed linen leggings and carried small pots of salt tucked into their sleeves. Not because they wanted to, but because the station master made them. And what about those who deviated? Well, they weren't always punished, but they were watched. Each yizhan had a logbook, and riders had to sign their route tablets with a stylus dipped in soot. If the signature was missing, smudged, or late, the station keeper would make note. A pattern of errors could lead to reassignment. Some got sent to the salt mines, others to imperial construction projects. One courier who tried to cheat his time logs was sent to shovel clay for the emperors. New duck pond in Luoyang. He later returned, 4 years older, much thinner, and, according to one report, oddly fond of birds. Despite this, many couriers stayed for life. Why? Stability, a small stipend, room and board, and perhaps most of all, a sense of quiet usefulness. You weren't famous, but the empire kept moving because you did. It wasn't just government messages being carried. The Tang relay system also permitted private communication, though at a price. Merchants could pay a fee to send business letters between cities. Buddhist monasteries often sent scrolls, copied by hand, to sister temples across the country. And, occasionally, nobles sent wedding invitations or silk samples through the system, tied with green twine to indicate non-official content. There was even an informal courier poetry tradition. A few stations had chalkboards where passing riders left verses, couplets, or proverbs. Some were humorous. Dust in nose, rice in boot. This is the courier's daily route. Others more meditative. The sun moves west, and so do I. Each hoofbeat, one breath closer home. These snippets were rarely preserved, but a monk in the southern province of Yangzhou reportedly collected over 300 such verses in a volume titled Windwords from the Road. Only fragments survive, but they offer a glimpse into the inner world of those who seemed, on paper, so dutifully dull. One poem signed simply, Lan. My horse has no name, I forget it too. The road remembers us both. There is a certain poetry in that. Even the relay stations had their own rhythms. At night, the inns buzzed quietly with domestic tasks. Cloaks hung by the fire. Boots were checked. Horses watered. Porridge stirred. Riders rarely spoke unless necessary, but there was a shared sense of motion. Everyone in their slot. Everyone watching the hour. The station bells rang not for prayer but for timing. 3 bells for dawn departure. 1 bell if a rider was behind. 2 bells and a drumbeat for imperial dispatch. Rare but unmistakable. There were no shortcuts, no legends, no epics. Just boots, rice, scrolls, and the long, dust-choked road. But as the Tang century waned, things began to crack. Banditry increased. Outposts closed. Monasteries stopped receiving their scrolls. Some couriers abandoned their posts and vanished into villages or border towns. A few became monks. One, famously, became a brewer and claimed his beer was inspired by boiled rice bootliners. And yet, the roots still existed. Even into the 10th century, decades after the dynasty's collapse, a few stubborn couriers kept riding. They made their own tablets, patched their cloaks, rode between ghost stations, delivering letters to monasteries that no longer had abbots. When asked why, one old courier said simply, "The message doesn't know the empire is gone. There is something quietly noble in that, but it raises a question. What exactly was inside all those scrolls, beyond the poetry and military maps and dried-up contracts? What did the Tang believe needed to be carried above all else? Was it the emperor's word, the laws, or something older, quieter, and harder to pin down, like memory itself?" You're halfway between 2 stations now. The road is silent, the sky a dull canvas. Even the wind seems to have grown tired of moving. You adjust your grip on the reins, glance at the message tube tied to your belt, and keep riding. The terrain rolls gently around you, low hills, faded grass, and the occasional shrine built for a forgotten god. And somewhere out there, perhaps in your future, perhaps in your past, is the ghost of a courier named Jiao Ru. He was not famous in his lifetime. There are no surviving portraits, no statues. But his name appears in a minor bureaucratic complaint lodged in the year 812 CE, during the later days of the Tang dynasty. The complaint, written in stiff formulaic brushwork, simply says, "The courier Jiao Ru arrived without boots, soaked scrolls, and 2 days late." The reason for the delay, however, is where the story begins. According to the entry, Jiao was assigned to carry 3 messages from the provincial office in what is now Xi'an to a small outpost near the empire's northern edge. The road was known to be difficult in spring, as thawing snow turned the paths to thick, grasping mud. The route crossed a series of shallow rivers that, while normally manageable, became unpredictable during the rains. Joe set off with his usual gear, a waxed cloak, linen scroll tubes sealed with oil, extra rice tucked into his boots. And for the first day, all went according to routine. But on the second day, he encountered a bridge collapse near a village whose name has since disappeared from all maps. Rather than turn back, he asked a local farmer if there was a fording point nearby. The farmer pointed him upstream to a narrow section of river where the rocks formed a sort of natural stepping path. There was a catch. It required walking the horse, not riding it. So Jiao dismounted, bundled the scroll tubes in oilskin, tied them under his arm, and coaxed the horse into the cold water. It went badly. About halfway across, the horse slipped, panic kicked in, and the courier fell backward into the current. The scrolls dunked briefly before he could scramble onto a flat rock, soaked and furious. The scrolls were recovered, damaged but legible. The complaint was filed anyway. Official ink doesn't forgive water stains, but what's interesting is not the failure. It's what Jiao did next. Instead of reporting the bridge collapse and waiting for reassignment, which would have been the regulation response, he dried the scrolls as best he could, retraced his route, bought fresh wrapping from a calligraphy stall, rewrote the addresses in charcoal, and walked the last 20 miles barefoot after his boots gave out. No fanfare, no bonus. Just a late arrival and a formal reprimand for damp protocol and poor time stewardship. Why does this matter? Because in the margins of that complaint, someone, likely a bored clerk, added a brief side note. This one walks like wind. We see his face and forget it. We see his dust and remember. It's not poetry exactly, but it became something, like legend. Later records show that Jiao continued his work for another 12 years. He never rose above junior courier rank. He never married, and his death was unrecorded. But his name appears again and again in border outposts, always with the same notation. Reliable, quiet, returns. Other couriers began referencing him in chalk verses at relay stations. Rue passed here. Bootless Rue made the hill. Scrolls dry this time, Jiao. He became a kind of in-joke among the Tang relay riders, part ghost, part standard. And then something unexpected happened. A story appeared in a northern province roughly a generation later, preserved in a small scroll now held in a museum in Nai, Gansu. It's written in vernacular Tang Chinese and titled simply, "The Man Who Rode Through the River Twice." In it, a nameless courier refuses to abandon a scroll that's been soaked in a river crossing. Instead, he rewrites it from memory after, drying it over pine coals. The local station master tells him, "You should have just reported it ruined." But the courier replies, "The words asked to arrive." That phrase, "the words asked to arrive," would go on to be used in Tang poetic circles, Buddhist commentary, and even in later courier manuals. It appears in a Song Dynasty legal text as justification for reinstating a suspended rider. But of course, there's no proof that this figure was Jiao Ru. Maybe the story came from someone else entirely, or maybe it was never true at all. But that's not really the point, is it? For all its regimentation, the Tang courier system allowed for small, human acts of stubbornness. Moments where a single rider decided the message was more important than the rules, or the mud, or the cost. The truth is, history rarely remembers couriers unless they make a mistake, or a legend. Which brings us to the final scroll of this story. In May 845 CE, near the end of the Tang dynasty's golden period, an imperial librarian named Zheng Yishi submitted a lengthy report on lost texts during the great anti-Buddhist purges. In the report, he mentions that certain scrolls were saved not by scholars or monks, but by a handful of low-level couriers who smuggled them out under false labels, marking sutras as tax records, or stashing philosophical commentaries between household tallies. One name appears again, Jiao Ru. This time, not as a failure, but as a footnote. The courier Ru preserved a scroll of the Heart Sutra by hiding it in his cloak lining. No official award followed, no promotion, but the scroll survived. Today, that same Heart Sutra copy is housed in Kyoto, and although its provenance is debated, the ink, handwriting and watermark all trace back to the late Tang period, near the very region where Jiao rode bootless, dusty, possibly stubborn beyond regulation. So why did couriers sleep in their boots? Because time wasn't theirs. Because the scrolls didn't wait. Because comfort was a delay they couldn't afford. And perhaps because boots were more than protection. They were a silent symbol that you were always half in motion. In a way, the Tang couriers carried not just messages, but the shape of the empire itself. Each hoofbeat echoed the rhythm of a society built on invisible lines of trust and repetition. And Jiao Ru? Maybe he was just one of thousands, or maybe he was the quiet pulse of something larger, resilient, unrecorded, and still somehow moving forward. You are walking through a Roman street, perhaps in the city of Aquae Sulis, what is now Bath, in the English countryside. The air is scented faintly with sulphur and olive oil. Around you, citizens move in slow waves, vendors arguing gently, children herding reluctant goats, and a man cursing a stone that has lodged itself perfectly into his sandal. Beneath your feet, something is flowing. A network, invisible yet omnipresent. The water that streams through the public fountains, the bathhouses, even the private villas of the moderately wealthy, comes through a quiet marvel of Roman engineering. Lead pipes. Yes, lead. The same metal that now graces health warnings and hazard labels was once the bedrock of Rome's most celebrated infrastructure. The aqueducts, vast and arched, often received the glory, but the humble lead pipe was the endgame, the domestic delivery system of an empire that prided itself on order and abundance. Let's go back to the beginning. The Romans, for all their ambitions, were profoundly domestic in their values. Comfort, predictability, and cleanliness were considered marks of civilization, and central to this was aqua, water, cold, hot, tepid, flowing at will. It wasn't just about survival. It was about civic pride. Lead, or plumbum, was relatively easy to source, soft to work, and highly resistant to corrosion. It could be melted, shaped, rolled, and sealed with comparative ease. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had developed a widespread habit of plumbing entire districts using lead conduits. These pipes were inscribed, often with the names of emperors or administrators, a form of quiet propaganda that said, "Your water is provided by the might of Rome." A pipe, in Rome, was not just a pipe, it was a message. You can still find them today, some intact, some fragmented, marked with stamps that say things like Imp, Saez, Nervae, Traiani, AVG, Germ Daci CVS. Translation: this pipe belongs to the Emperor Trajan, conqueror of Dacia. Enjoy your bath. But the story grows stranger. Even though Roman engineers noticed discoloration and occasional strange tastes in the water, they kept using lead. Why? Because it worked, and because the alternative, clay, bronze, or ceramic, was often more brittle or expensive. Some historians believe the Romans offset the effects by mixing in calcium-rich spring water, which created a thin mineral coating inside the pipes. This layer may have helped shield them from the full effects of lead leaching, but no one is entirely sure. What is sure is this: the entire city of Rome and its far-flung colonies pulsed with lead-lined veins, feeding everything from grand, public baths to modest garden fountains. These systems were monitored by a special bureaucratic class of water officials, known as curatores aquarum. These curators oversaw everything from allocation to enforcement. If you siphoned off water illegally from a public line, you could face stiff penalties, including in extreme cases exile. Stealing water was not just theft, it was an offense against public health and the emperor's reputation. And so, the pipes were buried, tended, whispered through, and, on bad days, blamed for everything from stomach cramps to divine displeasure. There are stories from the late Republic of Senators refusing to drink public water because of an odd smell, of bath attendants quietly filtering water with linen cloth, of markets selling jugs of spring-pulled water at a premium to the mildly paranoid. But even as unease simmered under the surface, the convenience outweighed the concern. Lead plumbing was quieter than aqueducts, less likely to freeze in winter, and incredibly adaptable to Rome's complex urban grid. It turned hygiene from an act of survival into a daily luxury. Of course, there were drawbacks. The pipes corroded unpredictably. Blockages formed from silt or plant matter. Animals occasionally crawled into the system and did not exit. Flushing a bath could sometimes mean flooding a courtyard, and leaks, unseen and silent, could undermine entire pavements. Still, Rome persisted. The average domus, a respectable middle-class Roman home, might have had cold and hot water taps fed by lead lines that passed through a caldarium, hot bath, and frigidarium, cold bath, and then drained into a shared sewer beneath the street. Waste, in many cases, exited just as efficiently as it entered. But don't romanticize it too much. Roman plumbing, while advanced, did not involve sinks or proper toilets in most homes. Many Romans still relied on chamber pots, emptied into the street gutters with the time-honored cry of Gardilu, or its Latin equivalent, cave tibi, watch out. The truly elite had private toilets, small stone seats above flowing channels. These weren't luxurious so much as strategic, placed far from kitchens, near the edges of gardens or atriums, and often perfumed with garlands or incense. For the rest, it was public latrinae, communal affairs with long benches, open holes, and a shared sponge on a stick, rinsed between uses in vinegar water. Yet even in these public spaces, lead played its part. Pipes carried clean water in and carried wastewater out. The constant flow was a symbol of efficiency and health, even if the details were less elegant. But here's the odd part. Despite the known dangers of lead today, Rome didn't collapse because of its pipes. The real culprits in the empire's slow decline were political, economic, and military. The plumbing remained long after the Senate rooms fell silent. In some regions, it even functioned centuries after the legions withdrew. There is a quiet irony in this. The very infrastructure meant to express Roman superiority, engraved with imperial names and forged from soft metal, outlived the emperors themselves. You can still find segments of Roman lead pipes buried beneath London, split beneath fields in Tunisia, or twisted into strange coils in ruined villas near Naples. Some are on display in museums. Others lie untouched, humming faintly with the ghosts of aqueducts and lost appointments. Even now, if you trace the maps of Roman plumbing, some scribbled by Victorian archaeologists with too much ink and too little accuracy, you can almost hear the rush of the old water, sloshing through a civilization that prized control above all. Control of the land, control of the sea, and control of where the water went and when. But who maintained these pipes? Who fixed the leaks, smoothed the joints, and argued about whose bath got the hottest stream? That's where we'll go next. Because in the next section, we'll descend into the underworld of Roman plumbing maintenance, where slave crews, migrant engineers, and disgruntled citizens all tried to keep the empire flowing, one badly sealed, joint at a time. Water always finds the lowest path, and in the Roman Empire, that path often led to men whose names were never recorded. Down alleyways and into the subterranean dark, there were people tasked with keeping the veins of the city open. They were the silent workforce of Roman urban life: plumbari, lead workers, tectors aquarum, water repairers, and general labourers who, quite literally, crawled through the arteries of empire. You might imagine an aqueduct as something gleaming and triumphant, but it was often the inverse. Damp, mosquito-laced, and prone to irregular dripping from weak points in the mortar. Pipes, when they cracked or clogged, required more than quick patchwork. They demanded knowledge, sometimes even artistry. The plumbarius, whose name survives in the modern word plumber, was both technician and craftsman. He would cast sheets of lead, plumbum, shape them into pipes, then solder them using heat and tallow. Joints were smoothed with wooden paddles or small stones to ensure a perfect seal. A good plumbarius could fix a ruptured conduit with minimal disruption, especially important when the line served a wealthy client or a public bath. And those bathhouses, often thought of as idle pleasure palaces, were in fact hydrological nightmares. Heating systems underneath, water above, steam all around. A leak in the wrong corner could mean the collapse of an entire hypocaust floor, not to mention furious letters to local officials. Plumbers, when dispatched, had to navigate not just technical issues, but politics. The wrong repair at the wrong time could make them the target of elite ire. And if they overcharged, or were thought to be siphoning off a trickle for private resale, that could land them in court, or worse, chained to a municipal labour team for life. Some repairs were easier than others. A clogged fountain, for example, might just need a flush with a goatskin bladder. But a cracked main line, under a basilica, that was a week of darkness, crawling in muck, whispering Latin curses as rats scuttled past. Rome's water system was a paradox of brilliance and fragility. On paper, it was brilliant. A system of 9 major aqueducts, hundreds of distribution tanks, called castella, and miles of lead piping that segmented flow to every corner of the city. But in reality, it leaked. Constantly. In fact, it leaked so often that by the 1st century CE, the Emperor Augustus appointed a water commissioner with near dictatorial powers to oversee the system. His name was Marcus Agrippa, and his reforms included mapping all the pipes, sealing unauthorized taps, and hiring teams of inspectors to police water theft. These inspectors, the aquarii, carried tablets and little weights. They measured water, flow to each house or business, making sure no one was getting more than their allotted share. If someone had bribed a worker to bore an extra hole into the pipe, that person could face steep fines or public humiliation. Water theft, oddly, became a social issue, not because it was dangerous, but because it was unsightly. It implied greed. It disrupted flow to bathhouses. It made senators grumble about declining morals, which was their favourite pastime anyway. Yet for all the regulation, maintenance remained deeply physical. A leaking pipe had to be found by sound. Men walking with sticks, tapping the soil, listening for the faint gurgle of a breach. Once located, the ground was dug, the line lifted, the crack soldered. The old pipe might be reused. Or it might be melted down, reshaped, and stamped with a new name. Sometimes the names on pipes read like political resumes. Under the supervision of Lucius Junius Silanus, praetor of the waterworks, which was ironic because Lucius Junius Silanus never soldered a single pipe in his life. But the stamp made it clear this water and its delivery was under the watchful eye of power. In provincial cities, the story was much the same, though often more chaotic. In Gaul, in Syria, in Britannia, Roman engineers had to adapt to local stone, local weather, and local customs. Lead was used where it was available. Elsewhere, clay or wood might serve, but the method was consistent. Water was sacred, and so too was its infrastructure. Interestingly, while Rome was building plumbing miracles, other great civilizations had their own systems, often less flashy, but just as effective. The Persians used underground qanats. The Chinese engineered complex irrigation canals. The Mayans carved hidden reservoirs into limestone. Yet Rome's use of lead was unique in scale and stubbornness, even as some physicians, like Vitruvius, warned about the effects of lead poisoning, complaining of stomach cramps, pale skin, and minds that wander. The pipes kept flowing. Why? Partly habit, partly the inertia of success, and partly because no one could prove a better system that was equally affordable and easy to maintain. Besides, Romans had other concerns. Their focus was not so much health as status. To have running water in your home, piped directly by the city, was the ultimate flex. It meant you were part of civilization, that you were clean, that you perhaps didn't need to beg a slave to draw water from a well every morning. Even the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill had its own elaborate plumbing network. Cold and hot taps, steam chambers, overflow fountains, and always, somewhere, a lead pipe hissing softly behind the wall. The irony. Many of these luxurious water systems didn't age well. Over time, the lead grew brittle. Joints loosened. Earthquakes shifted the lines. In Pompeii, for instance, archaeologists have found dozens of lead pipes half split or patched hastily. suggesting that even before the city was buried, the plumbing was a source of constant concern. Yet no one stopped. The system limped along, powered by civic pride and occasional repair crews, right up until the empire itself began to crack. And when Rome fell, the water slowed. In some cases, invading tribes saw no need to maintain the pipes. They preferred wells and springs. In others, the knowledge of how to repair lead lines simply disappeared. Like so many other fragments of classical engineering, the infrastructure became ghostly, perfectly formed channels that carried nothing but wind and lizards. And yet, for centuries, fragments remained. Medieval peasants sometimes reused Roman pipes to line pig troughs or shield roof beams. Monks puzzled over water tunnels that led nowhere. And in Renaissance times, a few brave tinkerers tried to reanimate the old systems, melting down what was left to serve new fountains in Florence or Paris. Still, the real stories, the names, the sweat, the burnt fingers, were gone. The men who soldered in silence, who crawled under palaces with smoke in their eyes and brass tools at their side, had vanished into the soil. Their legacy? A million small joints, mostly forgotten. But were they truly ignorant of the dangers? Did they know what they were working with? That question lingers in the damp, echoing corridors of historical silence. Some say yes, others argue no. What we do know is this: the pipes carried more than water. They carried a philosophy, one that valued convenience over caution, image over inquiry. Still, the story isn't quite done. Because there was one final paradox at the heart of Rome's lead obsession, something that even the emperors didn't fully grasp. And it's a detail that modern science, centuries later, would uncover with strange and sobering clarity. But that discovery, quiet and unnerving, belongs to the last section of our tale. It wasn't until the 20th century that scientists began to understand what Roman engineers never fully could, that the lead piping they so admired, stamped with the names of emperors, tribunes, and proud engineers, was quietly altering the health of an empire. For centuries, scholars argued whether the widespread use of lead contributed to Rome's decline. The theory was first proposed in the 19th century and re-emerged in various forms, some sober, others more theatrical. Some pointed to lead poisoning as a culprit for erratic emperors. Others imagined generations of citizens slowly losing mental sharpness, affected by cumulative exposure. But the truth, as it often is in history, lies somewhere quieter. What we do know is this: lead leaches into water more readily under specific conditions, particularly when the water is acidic or sits stagnant in pipes. In Rome's case, water flowed constantly, reducing the chance of prolonged exposure. Moreover, much of it came from calcium-rich springs, which left a coating of mineral deposits inside the pipes, forming a kind of protective scale. In that sense, the empire's aqueducts may have accidentally shielded citizens from the worst effects, but not entirely. Traces of lead have been found in the bones and teeth of ancient Romans, especially among the wealthy, who had more access to piped water. More tellingly, analysis of sediment from ancient harbours like Portus and Ostia revealed significant levels of lead, consistent with wastewater runoff from Rome's extensive plumbing systems. It wasn't just the pipes. Romans used lead in cookware, in cosmetics, in paint, and most famously, in sweeteners. The compound sapa, a reduced grape must boiled in lead vessels, created lead acetate, a sweet, syrupy substance sometimes called sugar of lead. It gave Roman wines a smoother taste. Writers like Pliny the Elder even praised its flavour. This syrup was added to food and drink, and it was likely consumed in significant quantities by the upper classes. Physicians at the time, notably Dioscorides, noted that lead could cause melancholia and abdominal pain. Yet the practice continued. Imagine it, an elite Roman banquet, the pipes hissing softly in the courtyard fountain, goblets filled with wine laced with invisible toxins, and peacocks roasted over open flames. The symptoms, confusion, infertility, tremors, would come later. Perhaps they were dismissed as the toll of indulgence or the will of the gods. The average Roman, however, may have avoided the worst of this fate. The poor drank from public fountains, fetched water from rivers, and rarely had the luxury of sweetened wine. Ironically, their relative deprivation may have spared them from the full reach of lead's legacy. Still, the pipes remained. They were seen as marks of status, and in some ways, they were. Inscriptions on lead pipes, called fistulae, could declare not only the property owner, but even the source of the water, the aqueduct's name, and the official who oversaw the allocation. These stamps weren't just bureaucratic, they were assertions of control. They said, this water belongs to someone, this pipe was authorized, this flow is legal. Unauthorized pipes were sometimes called clandestinae fistulae, and their discovery could spark investigations, fines, or accusations of corruption. In that way, the plumbing system wasn't just a delivery tool, it was a surveillance network. Behind it all, a strange trust persisted. Trust in the engineering, trust in the material, and trust in the permanence of infrastructure. And this trust was so deeply rooted that centuries later, long after Rome had fallen and its aqueducts had crumbled, medieval builders often reused Roman lead. The pipes, still intact in many cases, were cut, bent, and reshaped into roof linings, organ pipes, and even church decorations. Lead was simply too useful to ignore. Even Renaissance scholars, marveling at the ruins of Rome, saw the remnants of its plumbing not as a health hazard, but as genius made manifest in metal. They praised the system's elegance, not knowing, or perhaps not caring, about the potential cost. In the end, there's no solid proof that lead poisoning brought down Rome. The empire fell for many reasons: economic decay, overextension, military decline, political rot. But the lead pipes remain a potent symbol, a literal and metaphorical infrastructure that carried both progress and peril. And there's one more twist to the story. In 2014, researchers from France and the United States analyzed sediment cores from the Tiber River. They found that during the height of the Roman Empire, lead levels were up to 100 times higher than in pre-Roman layers. This suggested not just domestic exposure, but environmental contamination on a massive scale, leaching into rivers, soil, and possibly into food chains. This wasn't simply a story of wealthy men sipping toxic wine. It was a civilization-wide experiment in plumbing, one that left behind an invisible signature in the very earth beneath Rome. Today, the ruins of the aqueducts still stand, arched and empty. The fountains still splash in Roman piazzas, fed now by modern pipes. Tourists walk past them daily, unaware of the silent, silvery thread that once tied a world together. You might ask yourself, did the Romans know? Some likely did. Warnings from thinkers like Vitruvius and Galen show that the hazards were suspected. But suspicions are often lost beneath convenience, especially in systems that seem too big to fail. In the end, the lead pipes of Rome weren't just a tool. They were a metaphor for ambition, for brilliance, and for the quiet consequences of ignoring what cannot be seen. Even today, across the world, lead piping remains a public health issue. Its dangers are well documented. And yet, in some cities, it remains because replacing it is costly, because the risk is manageable, or simply because it's always been that way. The story of Roman lead pipes isn't ancient history. Not entirely. It's still flowing beneath our streets, humming quietly behind our walls, waiting for someone to ask, what exactly are we choosing to carry? And so, as the story ends, we're left not with a dramatic collapse or a poisoned emperor, but with a more ordinary truth, that even the most brilliant systems, when unchecked, carry costs far beyond their creator's intent. The Romans gave the world roads, laws, and literature, but they also gave us the first great lesson in infrastructure risk, a warning soldered into every pipe. In the city of Babylon, where the Euphrates flowed slow and wide under pink twilight skies, there existed a class of workers who began their duties not with the rising sun, but precisely as the city began to sleep. These were the dream interpreters, quiet figures with ink-stained fingers and robes smudged with ash, who served in the dim recesses of temple complexes. To the casual observer, they may have seemed like little more than scribes or priests, but to the superstitious and politically cautious Babylonians, they performed a function as vital as any general or governor. They read the messages of the gods. Babylon, like much of Mesopotamia, existed in a state of near-constant consultation with the divine. The gods, it was believed, sent messages through the sky, through animal entrails, through the flight of birds, and most notably, through dreams. And not just grand, vision-filled dreams from kings and nobles. Even the dreams of ordinary people could be deemed worth interpreting if recorded properly and brought to the right person. And so, throughout the Neo-Babylonian period, especially around the 7th to 6th centuries BCE, temple scribes maintained overnight logs of dreams, turning personal visions into clay tablets, labeled, categorized, and stored like medical records. These weren't whimsical guesses. The interpretations were systematic, even scientific by the standards of the time, built on generations of observation. Thousands of these interpretations were compiled into what we now call the Ishkar Zakuk, an extensive collection of dream omens inscribed in cuneiform on clay tablets. Some of these tablets have survived, allowing us a glimpse into the nocturnal bureaucracy of ancient Mesopotamian thought. The system worked like this. If you had a dream and you felt it might be significant, you could go to a temple. There, if you paid a small offering, or in some cases simply brought food or incense, a temple scribe might interview you. You'd describe the dream, and they'd consult the tablets. If you had no dream, but wished to receive a message from the gods, there were other options. Rituals for incubation were available, where a petitioner might sleep on a mat in a sacred courtyard, hoping for a divinely sent dream. The interpreters themselves were not seen as prophets. They were more like functionaries of the divine post office, interpreting symbols, cataloguing events, and cross-referencing older dreams to see what they might mean. If someone dreamt of a lion, for example, it might mean royal favor, or impending danger, depending on the lion's behavior. A bird flying north might indicate good fortune, flying south, a loss of money. If you dreamt of your teeth falling out, it was usually a bad sign, something people across centuries still seem to agree on. But these weren't one-size-fits-all prophecies. The interpreter would take into account the dreamer's gender, profession, and social status. A soldier dreaming of fire might expect glory in battle. A merchant with the same dream could anticipate a loss in trade. The system was vast, and it was managed at night. Because dreams only occurred in darkness, the work of recording them happened between sundown and sunrise. This gave rise to a kind of nocturnal profession. Temple assistants tasked with writing down dreams, fetching omens, reading tablets by lamplight, and occasionally calming the more anxious visitors who feared they'd seen omens of death or ruin. These dream loggers were not elite priests or scholars. Often, they were apprentices, young boys learning cuneiform, training in ritual purity, and tasked with staying awake during long, yawning nights while Babylon slumbered. Some may have dozed at their posts, only to be woken by a restless dreamer, needing urgent interpretation. Others likely nodded off among the scrolls, dreaming their own dreams while surrounded by the records of others. One wonders, did they ever interpret their own? For the dream interpreters, life was shaped by silence. The grand daytime rituals of temple life, sacrifices, chants, and oracles, were replaced by a different sort of ceremony at night. Quiet footsteps, the hiss of oil lamps, the clink of styluses against wet clay, and the sound of murmured dreams being translated into prophecy. And the temples that hosted these night shift workers weren't small chapels. In Babylon, chief among them was the Esagila, the massive temple complex dedicated to Marduk, the city's patron deity. Here, dream interpreters worked under the authority of temple overseers, maintaining a kind of divine registry of night visions. The Esagila was a hub not just of worship, but of information, a central archive where scribes catalogued omens, lunar eclipses, and strange animal births, all seen as messages from the heavens. The dream logs were part of this same system, tied into a network of signs that temple elites used to advise kings and officials. It wasn't uncommon for a royal dream to be analysed alongside data from other sources: weather patterns, star alignments, market fluctuations. The ancient world, though steeped in mysticism, was also deeply curious, even analytical. The Mesopotamians weren't gullible mystics. They were tireless record keepers. For them, dreams were data, and it was laborious. Imagine spending your nights in a stone room, hunched over with a reed stylus, pressing wedge-shaped marks into a damp tablet, while trying to decipher whether a dream of a snake coiled in a jar meant illness or promotion. Each tablet had to be dried, stored, and cross-indexed, and over time, the collection grew massive. Some temples held entire libraries of dreams, anonymized, sorted, and consulted in emergencies. These records weren't locked away. They were living tools. A king's advisor might consult them during military planning. A merchant might use them to justify a risky venture. And ordinary people, farmers, potters, shepherds, came seeking reassurance that their fears were unfounded, or confirmation that something sacred had whispered to them in their sleep. It's tempting to assume this was all symbolic, that these interpretations didn't truly matter. But in fact, Babylonian legal texts and political decisions sometimes reference dreams. There are records of treaties delayed due to ominous dreams, coronations postponed, and even deaths attributed to ignoring prophetic warnings. The dream interpreters, for all their quiet roles, held significant influence, more than they might have realized. A single misinterpreted omen could sway a court, spark a public ritual, or change the course of someone's life. And yet, there's something human and familiar in their work. Despite the sacredness of their task, much of it was boring, tedious, exhausting, long hours of waiting, recopying old tablets, trying to keep the ink from freezing in winter, listening to patrons repeat their dreams with slightly altered details. It was, in short, a job, but a job that connected the everyday with the eternal. Because in Babylon, every dream mattered. Every whisper in the dark could mean something. Every image, no matter how mundane, a broken pot, a singing dog, a cloud shaped like a hand, was seen as a thread in the great woven fabric of the gods. Design, and still the scribes wrote, still they logged, still they turned the fears and fantasies of sleepers into records that outlasted empires. One must wonder, after all those hours spent deciphering signs and storing dreams on hardened clay, did the interpreters themselves ever doubt? Did they ever wonder whether the gods truly spoke, or whether the whole system was just habit? We don't know. They left no journals, no memoirs. Only the tablets remain, stacked and brittle, sometimes broken, sometimes miraculously whole. And, in the darkness of Babylon's long nights, with the stars reflected in the river, the temple lamps flickered, and the scribes waited for dreams to arrive. At some point in the quiet procession of Babylon's nights, a dream would be delivered that was not just personal or curious, but urgent. These dreams, usually from the upper echelons of society, came with scribes trailing behind them, tablets already half-etched with anxious notes, and temple runners dispatched to wake the senior interpreter. The most sensitive dreams were those of the king. For the ruler of Babylon, every detail mattered. A dream of climbing a mountain could suggest divine approval or warn of hubris. A vision of drowning might be seen as the gods rescinding their favor, and the stakes were high. No Babylonian monarch wanted to repeat the fate of past kings who had ignored or misread the messages of sleep. Take, for instance, King Nabonidus, who ruled in the 6th century BCE. His reign was marked by an unusual obsession with omens, particularly dreams. Records show he frequently withdrew to distant temples, seeking clarity from his dreams rather than consulting the urban priesthood. Some historians speculate this contributed to the weakening of his political base in Babylon. A king governed more by symbols than by his counselors. One tablet fragment, now in the British Museum, records a troubling royal dream. He saw the moon fall from the sky and turn to dust upon the earth. The interpreter's note on the side is terse and oddly passive. This may indicate the end of his name. Not his life, his name. In Babylon, that could be worse. The fear wasn't just death, it was erasure. A name forgotten meant spiritual disconnection, no offerings, no memory, no legacy. The interpreters bore the weight of rendering these dreams into actionable language, sometimes advising ritual cleansings, sacrifices, or even policy shifts. But not all dreams came in golden chariots. Many arrived quietly, barefoot and uncertain. Goat herd from the western fields, whose name is lost to time, is recorded in one tablet as having dreamt that his flock sang to him. He walked 2 days to the temple to have it interpreted. The scribe, a novice judging by the uneven strokes of the clay, noted simply, "Goats do not sing. This is a vision of unexpected news. He should be cautious of strangers." We don't know if the goat herd ever received that news, but his dream lives on. Dreams, for the Babylonians, created a strange democracy. Kings and commoners alike could receive divine messages. The gods did not favor the literate or the wealthy when sending their nocturnal signs. It was the interpreters who mediated that difference, translating the language of gods into the paperwork of men. And while the temples were the official channels, many independent dream interpreters existed on the fringes of society, especially near marketplaces. These were freelance readers, less respected perhaps, but often more accessible. A woman might set up a small stall with offerings of barley and perfume, offering to interpret dreams in exchange for a handful of dates or a length of wool. Some were likely charlatans. Others may have been genuine, trained in temple methods, but operating outside the formal priesthood. Either way, their existence underscores how deep dream culture ran in Babylonian daily life. It was not restricted to the sacred precincts. One curious fragment suggests the existence of dream salons, places where people gathered to discuss their dreams communally. The text mentions 7 women who dreamed of the same well, and an elder who said their visions were one. Were these early support groups, ritual gatherings, or merely gossip sessions elevated to cosmic importance? The line between psychology and theology was thin. Meanwhile, temple dream interpreters often dealt with dreams that repeated, a troubling sign. If someone dreamt of falling, then returned a week later reporting the same dream, the response escalated. A ritual might be recommended: bathing in a specific part of the river, burning cedar and inhaling the smoke, avoiding certain foods, staying indoors on a certain day. This wasn't just superstition. It was a kind of proto-therapy, behavioral modification by myth. And then, of course, there were the forbidden dreams. Some dreams were considered too dangerous to be recorded. If a person dreamt of harming the king, or of the gods falling from the sky, they might be gently discouraged from speaking further. One interpreter's note reads simply, "The petitioner was advised not to remember." To forget a dream was itself a kind of ritual, and it's in these delicate acts of silence that we begin to understand the other role of the interpreter, not just to explain, but to contain. They were not only translators, they were filters. A dream that could spark panic might be interpreted gently to avoid causing unrest. A vision of disaster might be recast as a warning rather than a certainty. Interpretation, in Babylon, wasn't just descriptive, it was protective. Still, not every dream needed decoding. The temples had categories. Some dreams were labeled empty dreams, thought to be the result of overeating, illness, or anxiety. Others were true dreams, usually those that occurred before dawn. believed to be the clearest time for divine contact. If a dream occurred in the early night, it might be chalked up to mundane causes. But a dream just before waking? That demanded attention. One surviving tablet puts it bluntly: dreams of the third watch are closest to Marduk. And so, temple staff remained most alert between midnight and sunrise, often half asleep themselves. It's likely many dreams were recorded under flickering lamps, with yawning scribes barely able to stay focused. Yet still they documented, interpreted, catalogued. Because if they didn't, who would carry the message? The clay tablets themselves had their own quiet language. A red mark in the corner meant the dream had been considered ominous. A double underline indicated a repeat petitioner. A symbol like a wave or zigzag meant uncertainty in the interpretation. These were margin notes of the ancient mind, footnotes to fear. It's hard not to see modern echoes in these practices: the late-night dream loggers, the way patterns were charted, the quiet fear of repetition. Today, we might use brain scans and psychology. But in Babylon, the mind was sacred territory, best explored with ink, firelight, and ritual phrases whispered in the dark. Sometimes, dream interpreters issued warnings, sometimes reassurances, and sometimes they simply said nothing, allowing the dream to rest, unexamined, in the mind of the dreamer, because not every dream demanded a response. Some were meant only to drift, to be forgotten, to be lost among the countless others that floated like river foam down the long current of Babylonian night. And yet, what happened to those who ignored their dreams? What of the merchant who dismissed a vision of wolves surrounding his shop? Or the mother who dreamt of a snake coiled in her bread oven and told no one? Did the scribes keep track of outcomes? Did anyone ever return days or weeks later and say, "It happened, just like you said"? Or were the interpreters left in a kind of permanent ambiguity, casting meanings into the dark and never knowing if they were true? The tablets do not say, but the questions remain, quiet and persistent, like dreams themselves. Somewhere beyond, the low sandstone corridors and oil-lit altars of the temple district, past the spaces reserved for public ritual and priestly ceremony, sat a quieter room. It was not ornate, nor sacred in any visible sense. No hymns were sung there, no incense burned. And yet, for the dream interpreters of Babylon, it was perhaps the most vital chamber of all. This was the archive room, an unassuming storehouse lined with clay tablets, wrapped in linen, sorted by signs and symbols few outside the temple could read. It was where the dreams lived after they had been told. Thousands of tablets, tens of thousands, if the records are to be believed. Each one bore the faint indentations of a reed stylus, pressed carefully into soft clay before it dried under the sun or a low fire. The oldest of these tablets may have recorded dreams from centuries past, their edges worn and flaking, but their meanings preserved. Dream of fire, warning of illness, dream of dogs howling, approach of strangers, dream of flying, divine protection or delusion depending on context. The dream archives were organized meticulously, not by date, but by type of dream. There were sections for animal dreams, sections for celestial omens, sections for water, food, buildings, violence, love, and death. If a person dreamed of milk spilling, the scribes would find 3 or 4 past tablets with similar visions, review the outcomes, if recorded, and use those as the framework for interpretation. This is what made Babylon's dream interpreters different from mere mystics. They were historians of the subconscious. They compared, contrasted, catalogued. Their work was part art, part data analysis, and all of it was recorded with the same kind of neutral patience you might find in a modern library catalogue. For example, a man saw a white crow land on his shoulder, outcome unknown. Previous instance resulted in quarrel with brother. Or, a woman dreamed her left hand turned to wax and melted under the sun. She was advised not to travel east. The detail is staggering, the interpretations often ambiguous, but there's a method there, an ancient form of pattern recognition that treated dreams not just as isolated messages, but as part of a larger, repeatable system of meaning. Modern scholars sometimes refer to this body of work as the Babylonian Book of Dreams, though it was never a single volume. Instead, it was a growing, evolving database, an open-ended encyclopedia, written one restless night at a time. And yet, many tablets were unsigned. The scribes did not leave their names. The interpreters remained, in most cases, anonymous. Perhaps they saw themselves as mere conduits, not authors. Or perhaps anonymity was part of their sacred duty. Still, some scribes could be recognized by style. One interpreter, known only through modern shorthand as the sibilant scribe, had a curious habit of beginning dream interpretations with the phrase, "It is said among the elders." Another, whose tablets are marked by unusually tight script, often included small sketches, a fish, a bowl, a crescent moon, not meaningful, necessarily, just doodles, perhaps, from a sleepy hand. It makes you wonder, who were these people? Not priests in the usual sense, though they worked in temples. Not scientists, but their method was empirical. They occupied a strange and liminal role in Babylonian society, guardians of a realm between sleep and waking, faith and observation, and they rarely rested themselves. There are records suggesting that the dream interpreters took shifts throughout the night, always keeping someone awake in case a petitioner arrived with a vision too urgent to wait. They slept in turns, in narrow stone chambers near the archives, on mats of reeds or coarse wool. It's easy to imagine one of them, half awake, rubbing their eyes, sitting down beside a fire basin to copy yet another tablet from a dreamer who'd walked miles to report seeing a tree burst into flame and speak in a dead relative's voice. Was it real? Did it matter? The act of recording made it real in a sense. Once impressed into clay, the dream joined the canon of Babylon's sleep visions, and the archive grew. Some temples are thought to have housed over 1,000 dreams at any given time. Periodically, the older ones were reviewed, updated, or even ceremonially buried, deemed no longer relevant or replaced by more recent parallels. These ceremonies, described only in fragments, involved incense and prayer. The dreams were not merely discarded, they were laid to rest, because in Babylon, dreams had afterlives. A recorded dream could be revisited years later, brought back to guide a new interpretation. There are references to ancestral dreams being invoked when similar signs reappeared. In this way, a dream might echo across generations, shaping lives long after the dreamer had turned to dust. There are even whispers of political manipulation through dreams. One controversial theory, proposed by modern scholars, suggests that interpreters were sometimes encouraged to guide interpretations in ways favorable to certain temple factions or rulers. If a nobleman dreamed of flying, typically a good omen, perhaps the interpreter would reframe it as a warning against ambition, should that noble be growing too popular. Hard to prove, but not hard to imagine. Because with dreams, as with oracles, the power lies in how the message is shaped. The city of Tenochtitlan itself was nourished by this slow choreography. Food arrived each day in the markets: corn, chilies, tomatoes, amaranth, and flowers by the boatload. Even the noble households, with their feathered warriors and scribes, relied on this agricultural ballet. There was no money as we know it. Instead, cacao beans and lengths of cotton were traded for vegetables, tortillas, and tamales, much of it grown on these little islands. And yet, for all its elegance, the chinampa system was invisible to the eyes of many outside the valley. Spanish accounts in the 16th century marveled at the floating gardens, but misunderstood their structure. Some believed they truly floated like rafts. Others dismissed them as too simple to last. But they did last. In fact, when Tenochtitlan fell to the Spanish in 1521, one of the few systems that remained functional through the chaos was the chinampa network. It continued to feed survivors even as temples were toppled and palaces burned. Even centuries later, when colonial planners filled in much of Lake Texcoco and drained vast wetlands to build Mexico City, a handful of chinampas held on. In Xochimilco, the southern fringe of the old lake, they still linger to this day. Some grow marigolds, others tulips. A few even cultivate the same maize varieties that once fed an empire. Tourist boats drift through them now, decorated in bright paint, floating with music and chatter. But in the quiet corners, if you find the right plot, you might see an old farmer with a stone hoe, dredging silt from a canal, whispering to his vegetables. He is part of a tradition nearly 1,000 years old. What he does each morning might seem boring to the modern eye. But beneath that simplicity is the echo of one of the world's most sophisticated sustainable farming systems, a practice born of mud and need, perfected in water and nourished by the stars. And yet, as dusk gathers, across the old valley, a question remains. How did these humble islands survive when empires did not? Though the chinampas of Tenochtitlan might seem like an agricultural footnote, just clever plots of floating soil, they were, in truth, embedded in the very cosmology and political life of the Aztec world. To cultivate a chinampa was not just to grow food. It was to participate in the turning of the cosmos, to mirror the great cycles above with order and discipline below. Everything had its time. Everything had its patron. The Aztecs did not plant simply when the soil felt warm or the rains began to fall. They planted according to the sacred calendar, or Tonalpohualli, a 260-day system intertwined with deities, days, and destinies. Each planting cycle was guided by gods. Each phase, seeding, sprouting, flowering, harvesting, was watched over, honored, and feared. To sow maize on the wrong day, or forget to make the right offerings, was not just a farming mistake. It was a spiritual breach. And so, amid the practical work of dredging canal mud or untangling roots, the chinamperos also kept track of time in sacred terms. Scribes might visit with folded bark paper codices, checking dates. Priests walked the canal edges during festival days, blessing fields with burning incense, or sprinkling lake water from bowls carved with serpents. Maize was not just a crop, it was a god. Centeotl, the maize deity, was youthful, green, and golden, the embodiment of nourishment and rebirth. In the rainy season, offerings were made to Tlaloc, the rain god, whose temperamental nature could flood chinampas one year and dry their mud to cracks the next. Sometimes, children were sacrificed in his honor, their tears said to ensure rain. Even this horror was folded into the cycle of growth, death, and return. The chinampa system thus became a kind of ritual landscape where daily labor, hoeing weeds, guiding a canoe between plots, collecting reeds, was also an act of devotion. It was not grand, not bloody, not glorious like war or temple ceremonies, but it was constant, quiet, enduring, and in its own way, more powerful. Because without food, even the priests would fall silent. The empire depended on the produce of these water farms, and to ensure they kept producing, the Aztec state regulated them with precision. Records were kept of what each district grew. Tribute requirements were set by imperial scribes, often paid in beans, maize, chilies, or baskets of fresh herbs. Markets flourished thanks to this supply. In Tlatelolco, the great twin city next to Tenochtitlan, daily markets could host over 20,000 people. On festival days, that number doubled. Traders arrived by canoe, their vessels heaped with chinampa-grown produce. Some came with rare flowers, for nobles, others with bundles of aromatic herbs, saplings, and even decorative moss used in rituals. The air was thick with smells, damp earth, maize cakes, crushed cocoa, and the occasional waft of burning copal from a nearby altar. Bartering was the norm. A basket of squash for a handful of cacao beans. A clutch of amaranth greens traded for a pair of duck eggs. And all of it flowed from the long, narrow plots that ringed the lake's southern edge. Interestingly, The Chinampas were not all alike. Some were family-owned, passed down through generations. Others were managed communally, especially in early periods. Later, as the empire grew, elite households gained control of larger tracts. Nobles even commissioned Chinampas solely to grow flowers, bright beds of xochitl and marigolds to adorn their altars and gardens. There were even Chinampas dedicated to cultivating medicinal herbs. Zapotl, used for toothaches, Tlacopatli for calming fevers. Aztec medicine, deeply tied to the natural world, often depended on these watery farms for ingredients. And then there were the floricultores, specialist flower growers, whose entire livelihood was built around colour, scent, and ritual beauty. In this, gardening bordered on art. They bred varieties for specific festivals, for noble hairdressings, for temple garlands. The Chinampa system wasn't just productive, it was aesthetic. Imagine then what a morning might have looked like. During the dry season, canoes slicing silently through the mist, farmers in embroidered cotton tunics gliding between fields, waterbirds calling, a child collecting floating duckweed in a basket, a woman brushing aphids from squash leaves with a rabbit tail whisk, and above it all, the steady wheel of the calendar, marking out the next ritual, the next sowing, the next tribute deadline. It was a system of labor and devotion, but also one of negotiation, because even in paradise, politics found its way. Some Chinampa zones, particularly those near the imperial center, were taxed more heavily. Others, in more remote areas like Xochimilco or Chalco, bargained for autonomy in return for loyalty, or for supplying goods that were less common, like specific herbs or fish. Disputes were handled through tribute courts. Boundary markers were checked and rechecked, and every so often a farmer might find his canoe broken or his canals mysteriously blocked, the result of a grudge or rivalry stretching back 2 generations. Still, compared to the clashing of armies or the burning of temples, these were quiet frictions. Life went on. The seasons turned, and always the lake breathed. Even today, buried under centuries of expansion, traffic, concrete, and pollution, parts of the old Chinampa system survive. In Xochimilco, south of Mexico City, a UNESCO World Heritage Site now protects the last remaining stretches. But they are in danger. Urbanization has choked the water supply. Pollution seeps in. Many Chinampas have been abandoned, their willows wilting, their soil compacted, their reeds overtaken by algae. Efforts are underway to revive them. Some NGOs and indigenous cooperatives are working to reintroduce sustainable Chinampa agriculture, both as a cultural preservation effort and as a model of ecological farming in an age of climate change. There's irony in that. What was once dismissed as primitive, a muddy trick of reed mats and elbow grease, is now being looked to for inspiration, not just because of its yield or its cleverness, but because of its harmony. The Chinampa wasn't an attempt to control nature. It was an agreement with it, a promise to take only what could be replaced, to feed the soil with what the lake gave, and to work in concert with wind, water, and root. That's not just boring history, it's quietly radical. But one question remains unanswered, lapping quietly at the edge of our curiosity like canal water on woven reeds. Did the knowledge of Chinampas die with the empire, or did it simply sink beneath the lake, waiting to rise again? As Spanish sails first appeared on the horizon of Lake Texcoco in 1519, the Chinampa farmers were beginning yet another season. They moved quietly between their plots, coaxing new seedlings from the lake's damp edges, their canoes stacked with maize, chilies, amaranth, and baskets of squash blossoms. To them, the empire felt eternal. The cycle always returned. The gods had been fed. The lake had always yielded. They could not have known it was the last season under the old sun. When the Spaniards arrived, drawn by gold and rumour, they were greeted by floating farms that looked like miracles. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Hernán Cortés's soldiers, described the city of Tenochtitlan rising from the water like a vision, ringed with canals and orchards on the lake. He was astonished, but also confused. What sort of civilization could grow flowers on water? They would soon find out. The conquest of the Aztec Empire brought not only steel and fire, but collapse. The temples were looted. The emperor was taken. Smallpox spread like wind. And in the chaos that followed, the delicate fabric of Chinampa life began to fray. But not all at once. The Spaniards, practical in their conquest, quickly realized the value of these strange floating gardens. Many were repurposed to supply the colonial capital, which had risen atop the ruins of Tenochtitlan. Indigenous laborers continued to farm them under new masters. Tribute, once paid in beans to the Tlatoani, now went to the encomendero. The gods were gone. The lake remained, and the Chinampas, with their deep roots and stubborn fertility, endured. In fact, the system was so efficient that colonial governors relied heavily on it to feed the growing city. For over 2 centuries after the conquest, the floating farms continued to flourish in regions like Xochimilco, Tláhuac, and Mixquic. Spanish chroniclers even noted that some of the best produce in New Spain came from these lacustrine zones. But time wore at the edges. The lake was slowly drained, first for flood control, then for land reclamation. The great dikes were dismantled. Tributary rivers were redirected. By the 1700s, much of Lake Texcoco had been reduced to patches of marsh. The water grew brackish. Trade routes shifted to land, and with less water came fewer Chinampas. Some were abandoned. Others were overtaken by dryland farms. A few were sold off in parcels to Spanish landlords. What had once been a symphony of mud, water, and willow now became silence and dust. Still, a few patches survived, especially in Xochimilco, a region where the lake's southern basin lingered, fed by underground springs and protected by the deep memory of the community. Here, Chinamperos resisted complete erosion, not with armies or petitions, but with routine. They kept tending their rows. They floated their canoes. They taught their children how to tie cuttings and when to harvest the Chinampa mud. The memory was no longer imperial. It was familial. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as Mexico modernized, interest in the Chinampa system flickered again. Scientists studied it. Agriculturalists wrote papers about it. A few reformers suggested its revival as a model for sustainable farming. But the push of urbanization was strong. Mexico City's population exploded. Its thirst for land and water deepened, and once again the Chinampas were pushed back. By the mid-1900s they were described as vanishing, but even vanishing things cast long shadows. A quiet movement of revival began in the 1980s and 90s. Local farmers, indigenous groups, environmental scientists, and urban planners joined forces, not with loud campaigns, but with compost bins, willow stakes, and reed bundles. They worked to clean canals, revive the underwater vegetation, ahuejote trees and tule reeds, and reintroduce traditional crop rotations. Some even turned to forgotten manuscripts, codices, colonial descriptions, oral memory, to recreate long-lost techniques, and the Chinampa, resilient as ever, began to breathe again. Today, in Xochimilco's protected ecological zone, hundreds of restored Chinampas now produce herbs, lettuce, flowers, and native maize using the old ways. Some farms have returned to canoe access only. Others use organic techniques that mirror ancient practices: mud compost, intercropping, lake-fed irrigation. School children visit them on field trips. Scientists measure them for carbon capture. Urban chefs prize the produce grown on them. And yet, they still sit quietly, just beyond the city's roar, behind a curtain of willows and mist. There are still challenges. Illegal landfills threaten water quality. Land speculators nibble at their borders. The water table is low. Invasive species clog the canals. Farmers often struggle to earn a living wage. But what persists is the philosophy, the quiet agreement between land and water, the belief that food doesn't have to scar the earth, that cycles are sacred, that nourishment is a kind of prayer. It's no accident that the word chinampa may have come from Nahuatl roots, meaning reed mat on the edge. It implies a border, a place neither fully land nor water, but something in between. That's what makes it beautiful and boring and worth remembering. So if you find yourself drifting to sleep tonight with visions of gardens that float, of willows swaying in canal breezes, of quiet men in canoes harvesting the first light pink squash blossoms of the season, then you're not just dreaming, you're remembering what the lake does, and perhaps, in the quiet of your imagination, you might even ask, if a garden once floated an empire, what forgotten things might still float ours? To the average citizen of Constantinople in the 9th century, the sea was a neighbour with moods. Sometimes it offered abundance, fishing boats gliding in with glistening nets, trade vessels bringing silk and spice. Other times, it brought peril, pirates, storms, or the unnerving quiet of mist curling around ships that never arrived. But no matter how the sea behaved, there was always a small flame in the distance, a gentle, wavering glow from the great lighthouse at the edge of the Bosporus, guiding both traders and travellers home. That light didn't burn on its own. It was the work of the Pharaophylaks, the lighthouse keepers of Byzantium, rarely mentioned. In grand chronicles or church records, these watchful figures were essential threads in the city's tightly woven fabric. The lighthouse itself, often believed to be modelled after the ancient Pharos of Alexandria, stood on a promontory near the imperial docks. Though far less ornate than its Egyptian predecessor, it shared a similar mission: to hold back the night with a steady flame and keep the empire's maritime heart beating. Each evening, as the sun slid into the Sea of Marmara, the keepers began their rituals. They carried large clay vessels of olive oil up a winding interior stairwell, slick with centuries of soot and brine. Their tunics were often plain, the hems stained from lamp wicks and sea spray. Some tied their hair back with scraps of linen to keep it from the flames. Others muttered prayers to St. Nicholas, the patron of sailors, as they climbed the narrow steps. At the summit, under a dome of rough stone, they tended to the lamps, row after row, of glass or bronze lanterns, each filled with thick oil and trimmed with hand-woven flax wicks. The central flame was largest, often set in a wide basin made of polished copper and shielded behind glass panes to guard against wind. From there, the light refracted outward through a rudimentary lens of polished quartz or smooth crystal. Keepers took turns trimming the wicks throughout the night. Every hour or so, they checked for flickers or smoke. Soot was wiped from the panes using rags dipped in vinegar. If a lamp failed, it had to be relit quickly. Too long a gap could lead a ship to flounder on the rocks below. And so, the night passed in shifts of walking, oiling, and watching. The sea, of course, was indifferent. It crashed or whispered at the tower's base. Fog rolled in some nights so thick the flames seemed to float in nothing. The cold bit through the stone. But the keepers stayed awake. They had tricks for it. Some chewed dried figs or mint leaves. Others clutched pebbles in their fists, dropping them into a brass bowl whenever their grip slackened. An ancient alarm clock of sorts. Stories passed between shifts. Arguments over which emperor had the most unkempt beard. Speculation on whether the Bulgarian fleet would ever return. Quiet jokes about imperial tax collectors who couldn't tell a galley from a fishing boat. Each shift was logged in a worn codex kept at the lighthouse's base, written in the careful script of the scribes who trained in monasteries. It recorded the time the flame was lit, the amount of oil consumed, and any incidents: fog, ship sightings, storms, or the occasional failure of a lamp. Some entries survive today. One, from a night in October of 845, reads, 3rd hour of the night. Wind, from the south, oil thick and slow, light disrupted by gull nesting on dome. Another, more ominous, 11th hour. Pirate sails glimpsed in mist, fire kept strong, signals sent. For the keepers the work was mostly quiet, often repetitive. But it mattered. They were the unseen caretakers of imperial trade, the quiet, protectors of inbound ships, the ones who stood between night and disaster. And though their hands smelled of oil and their robes bore salt stains, their job was held in modest esteem. They were granted exemption from most civic levies. Some were former sailors themselves, men who had once ridden the waves and now watched them from above. A few were monks assigned by seaside monasteries, offering their service as both prayer and duty. Food was basic: coarse bread, lentil stew, dried sardines. Sleep came in snatches during daytime hours, often on straw mats or thin pallets in rooms that hummed with the scent of oil. But there were also perks: a few copper coins a month, free passage on state ferries, and the occasional imperial commendation for faithful illumination. In time, as Constantinople evolved, so did the lighthouses. Later designs included rotating mirrors made of polished tin, allowing the light to sweep across the water in patterned arcs. Bells were added, struck during heavy fog or to signal warships. Some towers installed bronze weather vanes carved into the shapes of dolphins or saints, casting long shadows over the city's docks. But even as the technology improved, the essential rhythm remained: nightfall, flame, watch, trim, wait. The keepers did not write poetry, they did not lead armies, but they ensured the safety of those who did. Their tools were not swords or scrolls, but flint, wick, and patience. They moved through history like the flame they tended, never leaping, never loud, but steady, persistent, and just bright enough. And yet, as the centuries passed, so many names of these keepers faded. They were not martyred or buried in golden tombs. They likely died of cold or fever or old age in some wind-bent stone room beside their lanterns. And still, every night, someone else would climb the stairs, light the basin, and begin again. Which leads to a question the chronicles never answer. Did any of them ever wonder, as they stared into the black waves, who would keep the flame once they were gone? Down in the city below the lighthouse, Constantinople slept, or tried to. Dogs barked near butcher shops. Watermen slumped over oars tied to their docks. Somewhere, a baker stoked a pre-dawn fire. But above it all, in the quiet rhythm of night, the lighthouse keepers continued their peculiar vigil. Much of their night passed not in dramatic crisis, but in attentive waiting. Their ears tuned to the hiss of oil, the creak of wooden beams, the far-off groan of a hull-brushing stone. They were trained to notice small things: the difference between a ship's bow cutting steadily through water and the erratic slap of a drifting hull. Communication between lighthouse and shore was surprisingly advanced for the time. Lanterns flashed in sequence, short, long, short, to signal distress. Polished bronze reflectors, hammered into shallow dishes, and coated with ash to reduce glare, could direct beams at specific watchtowers along the city walls. At certain docks, young boys were posted as runners. If the lighthouse signaled danger, they sprinted barefoot through the night to raise alarms. Still, not every night was so urgent. Many were spent hunched over ledgers in tiny rooms tucked into the tower's base, scratching notes about fuel levels or wind direction. Boiled vinegar was used for cleaning the soot-blackened lamp glass, and the scent soaked into the walls. Some keepers wore tiny leather pouches of rosemary and laurel around their necks to mask it, a practice borrowed, oddly enough, from bath attendants in Antioch. The Byzantine bureaucracy, ever meticulous, issued manuals to guide lighthouse maintenance. These scrolls included instructions for trimming wicks: not too close, or the flame becomes anxious. Suggested lamp spacing, no more than 6 cubits between light points, and daily blessings to be whispered before each flame was lit. It's possible, though hard to confirm, that some lighthouses experimented with coloured glass, amber, blue, or green, fitted over small side lamps to indicate different messages. This would have been both decorative and functional, though the exact codes have been lost. Life for a lighthouse keeper could be surprisingly solitary. While most towers had a team of 3 to 5 keepers rotating in shifts, The upper chamber could often be occupied by just one. That solitude was both blessing and burden. Some filled it with quiet routines, sharpening knives, folding linen, polishing stones, reciting psalms. Others watched the sea like it was a slow-moving drama. Ships came and went. Grain barges from Egypt, warships bristling with oars, round-bellied merchant vessels carrying bolts of Persian silk or amphorae of Syrian wine. Occasionally, a boat would stop beneath the tower, and voices would float up in strange accents, asking for bearings or news of safe passage. On moonless nights, everything disappeared into inky blackness. Only the flame remained, and the soft lapping of water far below. These moments bred a special kind of imagination. Some keepers claimed to see signs in the waves, patterns that predicted weather or omens. One logbook describes a night when 2 dolphins circled the lighthouse for hours, leaping occasionally, as if signaling something. The keeper wrote simply, "They stayed until the stars shifted. The sea was calm." Others passed the time in debate. When 2 keepers were assigned the same shift, arguments might range from which emperor had the ugliest coinage to whether the flame was a divine symbol or merely a very stubborn bit of heat. Some debated which saints were best suited for maritime intercession. Saint Phocas, Saint Theodora. Opinions varied. On special nights, feast days, imperial anniversaries, the lighthouse was decorated with small banners or coloured cloth. These offerings fluttered in the wind and became sea-worn talismans until someone remembered to cut them down. There were also accidents, oil spills, fires that sputtered up from untrimmed wicks. Once, a keeper fell asleep and woke to find the main flame nearly extinguished. He relit it just in time, only to be punished with 3 weeks of latrine duty at a naval outpost, somehow worse than losing his post entirely. Still, for all its monotony, the job had its quiet rewards. There was the satisfaction of constancy, of knowing that no matter what storms broke across the city, whether wars, fires, or riots, the light would remain. Some keepers took pride in never having missed a single evening's lighting for decades. One man, Nikitas of Chrysopolis, reportedly served for 47 years, dying of old age with soot still under his nails. Fathers sometimes passed the role to sons. In rare cases, daughters trained in secret and served under false names. One document from the reign of Constantine VII mentions a certain Andreas, keeper of the outer light, whose handwriting shifts noticeably after his 4th year. Scholars speculate that Andreas may have been a woman, possibly the daughter of a retired keeper who continued her father's work under his name. But even these keepers, dedicated and largely invisible, felt the passage of time in quiet ways. Tower stones wore down where countless feet had climbed. The great iron oil cauldrons grew pitted with heat. The smell of fire and vinegar lingered longer each year, and sometimes a ship would fail to arrive, a merchant vessel overdue, a fishing skiff that never passed by again. The keepers marked these disappearances not with mourning, but with an extra lamp, lit for 3 nights in a row. No one instructed them to do this. It was just one of many small customs born in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn, and so, night after night, the flame remained. Constant, faint, patient. But how long could such constancy survive? With changing emperors, shifting coastlines, and new technologies on the horizon, would the humble tower of oil and brass be swept away by brighter beacons? Or would someone, centuries later, still climb the same steps, whisper a blessing, and trim the wick just right? The last century of the Byzantine Empire was a slow unraveling. Cities shrank. Trade routes shifted. Even the mighty walls of Constantinople, once invincible, began to seem more like relics than ramparts. But the lighthouse keepers remained, clinging to routine even as the world changed around them. By the late 1300s, the city had shrunk considerably. Entire districts lay in ruins. Ships still passed through the Bosphorus, but fewer stopped. Venetian and Genoese merchants controlled most of the port traffic now, and their loyalties were flexible. The empire's edges frayed, and the heartland beat more faintly by the year. but on the tower, the wick was still trimmed each night. Those later years, records become sparse. The meticulous scrolls once kept by the Office of Coastal Signals were replaced by informal ledgers, more personal, less formal, often scribbled on reused parchment. One keeper, known only as Thomas, left behind a bundle of notes spanning 18 years. His handwriting is thin and deliberate, almost hesitant, as if the act of writing itself was an effort to preserve a fading structure. He wrote about pigeons nesting in the rafters, about the sudden stillness before summer storms, and about ships that came from places he'd never heard of, speaking languages he couldn't place. He complained gently about sore knees from climbing the stairs, and about oil shipments arriving late, or not at all. In one entry, he writes, "A boy at the docks asked why I do this. I told him, so the dark stays where it belongs. There's something deeply human in that line, not grand, not heroic. Just a quiet insistence on usefulness, even in a time when usefulness seemed increasingly uncertain." In his final entry, dated just 2 weeks before the city fell to the Ottomans in 1453, Thomas wrote, "The flame was low tonight. Wind carried the heat sideways. I adjusted the reflector. It held. Then, a blank space. No further entries. We don't know if Thomas survived. We don't know if the lighthouse was destroyed, boarded up, or simply ignored in the chaos that followed. But the flame's disappearance marked more than the end of one man's watch. It symbolized a shift, the end of an era in which small, steady labours quietly held back the dark." There are stories, unconfirmed, that the Ottoman sultans later repurposed. Parts of the tower, some say it became a signal station again, using mirrors and flags. Others claim it was left alone for decades, too old-fashioned to be useful, too sturdy to dismantle. But echoes of the keepers remained. In the market stalls near Galata, vendors told children stories about the old lights, how they once flickered like stars above the sea. Some older sailors swore they could still feel the pull of those beams, even if the lamps had long gone out. One poem, written in the 16th century by a merchant poet passing through Constantinople, describes a ghost flame that danced on the Bosphorus, visible only to those who had lost their way. He writes, "A light not fed by oil nor touched by wind, but remembered by the tide. Whether real or imagined, the legacy of the keepers persisted, not in museums or marble statues, but in the rituals of those who sailed, watched, and waited in some fishing villages along the coast. Even centuries later, it was customary to leave a single lantern burning in a window on stormy nights. The light was said to guide the sea back to sleep." It's impossible to say whether this was inspired by the lighthouse tradition or born from some deeper human instinct. But the spirit was the same. Light, gently tended. Darkness, respectfully, held at bay. And perhaps that's the true lesson of those ancient keepers. They didn't change the world. They didn't win battles or write laws. But they carried out their duties with quiet fidelity, keeping the flame steady, night after night, for people they would never meet. When we think of history, we often remember the loud things, wars, revolutions, proclamations. But the lighthouse reminds us that quiet things matter too, that a small, consistent act, repeated for generations, can shape the rhythm of a civilization. In a world that often feels restless and fast, there's something comforting about that. About the idea that someone once stood in the wind, adjusting, a flame, simply so others could find their way. And perhaps, somewhere, there's still a tower, still a stair, still a lamp being trimmed against the dark.